Perspectives, which is really a lovely kind of event, too. I mean, not only lovely in its open nature, but I can't tell you how many times I've been invited to events where I'm supposed to yell at the other person and have, like, what do you call it, debate. I always hated those kids at debate club. You know, it's that sort of thing. Whereas I think that it's much more productive what Jen has mentioned here, and I hope we can come through with that. Okay, but here's now my question. As Adrian said, that Tony and I had thought, Tony, my co-author, and I had thought, well, at least we should divide the common into two parts, which have there's a connection, but they should be thought differently. On the one hand, thinking of the common as the earth and its ecosystems, the forest, the water, the air, etc. And on the other hand, the common, which are we argue actually central products in the emerging capitalist system today. Ideas, images, code, even communication networks, affects. Like, we claim that this is a central part of the economy today in a way that is superseded in a way industrial production as the centerpiece of capitalist production. And these two are common, or can be common, or we would even argue are tendentially common. The way ideas can be shared, the way communication can be code, images, music, etc. Okay, I think you see what I mean. So, here's then when I came to the question, and the question came from, or was posed to me most clearly when at the Copenhagen Climate Summit in 2009, in December. It was one of these UN summits of follow-up to Kyoto, really, in which in the conference center was you know, various government officials and corporations, of course, pretending to or trying to solve, you know, climate change problems. And what interested me was the protest movement outside of the summit. And what interested me in that most as what seemed to be quite a novelty is a confluence there of a tradition of anti-capitalist, alter-globalization movements that had been quite visible in the media, at least since the Seattle WTO protests in 1999, and environmental climate change movements, which were fundamentally different people and had operated differently previously. So I was thinking, it's interesting that both of them really focused on the common, but really on different sides or different notions of the common. You see what I mean? Like, the one is really focused on what I was calling the first one that I mentioned, like the earth and its ecosystem is common. The other one really about the products and the productive bases of a certain economic life today as being common, or that should be common. Okay, so what the difference though comes home intellectually for me in the difference of the common that the two groups were recognizing. So it's essentially important for the ecological and climate change groups to insist on the limitedness of the common. The limitedness, you know, of how much carbon we can put in the atmosphere, but also the limitedness of the earth. And so in their various slogans, the limits were always, in the big demonstrations, that's what it was always like. For instance, there is no planet B. You know, like, we have to work with this one. Okay. The altered globalization, people are much more focused on limitlessness of the common. The limitlessness of ideas, the limitlessness of even the productions, you know, of our possible human creativity. So, for instance, their favorite slogan, or my favorite slogan of, you know, the altered globalization movement is something like, "We want everything for everyone," which, you know, from the perspective of the environmentalists, looks like mutually assured destruction. Everything for everyone, like, we're dead. Whereas what the environmentalists were saying, you know, there is no plan B. It sounded to the altered globalization people like Margaret Thatcher, you know, like there is no alternative. Whereas for them, there always are alternatives. Another world is always possible. Whereas the environmentalists were saying something like, this world might still be possible, but probably not. You know, so it seems to be a very different notions of the common and the limitedness and the limitlessness. And I was relying on, and I guess I still am, on the movements themselves to work through this seeming contradiction. And I think that because they don't, I mean, I think these kinds of intellectual political contradictions that have repeatedly come up are often worked through and resolved best not through the work done in the university, but by the kind of theorizing that goes on in the movements themselves. In fact, I think even that term alter globalization was a result of, after Seattle, there was a great confusion not only in the press, but in the movements themselves, like, well, they're calling us anti-globalization, but we're not really anti-globalization, we're pro-globalization. Like, which is it? Are we pro-globalization or anti-globalization? And the movements themselves, over the course of years, worked through this recognition or this production of a term, alter globalization, which I think aptly resolved that seeming contradiction. You know, like, we are against the globalization of those corporations, but we're actually much more globalized than them, and that sort of thing. So I think in a similar way, this notion of, if I hope I expressed clearly enough, the at least seeming contradiction between two notions of the common that function on a different logic. I think that, yeah, or at least my faith is in the learning from the movements themselves might be the best way of addressing this. All this was still in the commons, what is it?
Did you want to articulate about the democratic movements?
That's good. Okay, I'll start on that, and then you can come with the democratic thing too. I think part of whenever we mention democracy in this context, we have to recognize how that concept, like I would say many of the central concepts in our political vocabulary, have been almost hopelessly corrupted. Democracy, freedom, like if you want to date it, after, it's probably much earlier than this, but after Bush's second inaugural address, I think he used the word democracy 137 times, and freedom equally as much. They both terms, by that time, and I would bring maybe 20 years earlier, at least to many of my friends, they seem completely off limits. I mean, what democracy means then is, at best, something like regular elections among a limited choice, but in fact, in most parts of the world, democracy means you better start running because the bobs are sure to follow. You know, so it means exactly the opposite of what we meant. But I would say freedom is similar kind of corruption. So what one has to do is, I think, well, you have two choices. Like one choice you have is you invent new concepts, but that annoys people and often doesn't work that well. And the other choice is to struggle over the concepts themselves. And that's what I think is necessary. You know, with Adrian's question, I would say the first thing you have to do is recognize the corruption of the concept of democracy and struggle over democracy and what it means in a common parlance and in a media designation, and what we think it can mean. There are a number of ways of struggling over a concept. I mean, one, which I do think is quite important, is a properly academic one, which is, you know, is a kind of scholarship about both recovering what such concepts have meant in the past and what they could mean, which is really a properly and usefully scholarly project. But I think here it's much more useful to think about how movements have both, what should we say, on the one hand, ridicule the pretense of democracy, of existing political systems, and then pose themselves alternative forms of participation, of self-governance, of autonomy that might fill out what could be meant by democracy. So I guess it's a complicated, I feel like one has to take a complicated or a double reaction to that question about the possibilities for democracy. It has to involve, although these things happen simultaneously, it's both a conceptual house cleaning, like sweep away these corrupted notions that we've inherited, and construct a real democratic. Now, real democratic, I mean, there's nothing intrinsic about it. I mean, construct what we want of a democratic movement and possibility. And often the movements have been centered, these struggles for democracy that I'm most interested in are centered around self-governance, autonomy, with, of course, equality and freedom, two essential concepts. In fact, before you start, but just one other thing that I find intriguing that I think we share, and I'm